So we begin with presentation 16 on the trail of blood, and we are getting closer to the end than we were when we started of the trail of blood. This particular presentation is actually more of U.S. history than it is anything else. And this is the final lecture that Dr. Carroll gave in his series, The Trail of Blood. And he entitled it Religion in the United States. Basically, when you look at the things that happened during the Dark Ages and then on into the Philadelphia church age that we considered in the last presentation, what do you have from that point on? The majority is you have the United States, because the gospel was being spread in other parts of the world, but it never caught on like it did in the beginning of the United States. In fact, our country was founded on the principles that you find in God's Word, principles that we have gotten so far away from now that, they used to call us a Christian nation. Well, it may be in name only. I would even hesitate to call it that now. But we find that the Reformation that took place in Europe didn't quite make it in America. We've seen, and when we've studied U.S. history, that people from Europe came to America because they were trying to escape what was happening, the persecution that was happening to them. But when they got here, they weren't any better. So we're going to look at it. Interesting. This is more U.S. history this morning, but very pertinent to our study. And this is Dr. Carroll's last presentation that he did. But because it's so lengthy, I've broken it up into two segments, and I'll present 16 this morning and 17 in the next one. Presentation 17, finish up the religion in the United States. And then we will consider the final Church of Asia that depicts this particular era of church history after we finish his last lecture, which will be presentation 18, and that will be the Church of Laodicea. So, let's continue in our text. Dr. Carroll says, through the Spanish and others of the Latin races, the Catholics as religionists came to be the first representatives of the Christian religion in South and Central America. But in North America, except Mexico, they have never strongly predominated. In the territory of what is now the United States, except in those sections which are once parts of Mexico, they have never been strong enough, even during the colonial period, to have their religious views established by law. The beginning of the colonial period, in the early part of the 17th century, the first settlements were established in Virginia, and a little later in that territory, now known as the New England states. Just as a side note, when I was pastoring in New York, there was you know how you see historical markers? Not far from where we had our church which is in North Byron, New York now. It was just right outside of Auburn where I started to work, but it is now located just a few miles farther north in a town called Port Byron, which was the original place that we wanted to start but couldn't find a place to meet. Not too far, just a little farther east, and I can't remember the name of the community, I ran across a historical plaque stating that this particular place, there was nothing there, just an empty space. It kept mowed and clean, but it was an empty space, where there was a Baptist church that had been in existence there since the turn of the 1700s. That gets it back pretty close, if not into the same era as what happened here in what we're studying today. And I thought, I'll bet you that church was a scriptural church in its day. So, religious, or more properly speaking, Dr. Carroll will continue with that, irreligious persecutions in England and on the continent were at least among the primary causes which led to the first settlement of the first United States colony. In some of the groups of immigrants which first came, not including the Jamestown group in 1607 and those known as Pilgrims in 1620, were two groups, one at least called Puritans, and these were Congregationalists. Governor Endicott was in control of their colony. The other group were Presbyterians. Among these two groups, however, were a number of Christians with other views than theirs, also seeking relief from persecution. Now, you note he doesn't say just Baptists. These refuging Congregationalists and Presbyterians established different colonies and immediately within their respective territories established by law their own peculiar religious views. In other words, Congregationalism and Presbyterianism were made the legal religious views of their colonies. This is to the absolute exclusion of all other religious views. Themselves fleeing the mother country with the bloody marks of persecution still upon them and seeking a home of freedom and liberty for themselves, immediately being established in their own colonies in the new land and having the authority, they deny religious liberty to others and practice upon them the same they had received. The southern colonies in Virginia, North and South Carolina were settled mainly by adherents of the Church of England. The particular views of the church were made the established religion of these colonies. Thus, in the new land of America, where many other Congregationalists, Presbyterians, and Episcopalians have come seeking the privilege of worshiping God according to the dictates of their own consciences, there were soon set up 3 established churches. And by the word established, we mean state churches. No religious liberty for any except for those who held governmental authority. Their own reformation is yet far from complete. With the immigrants to America came many scattering Baptists, by some still called Anabaptists. There were probably some in every American-bound vessel. They came, however, in comparatively small groups, never in large colonies. They wouldn't have been permitted to come in that way anyhow. But they kept coming. Before the colonies were truly established, the Baptists are numerous and almost everywhere. But they soon began to feel the heavy hands of the 3 state churches. For the terrible offenses of, quote-unquote, preaching the gospel and refusing to have their children baptized, opposing infant baptism, and other like conscientious acts on their parts, they were arrested, imprisoned, fined, whipped, banished, and their property confiscated, etc., etc., etc. No better than it was where they had come from. As we say, they jumped out of the frying pan into the fire. All that here in America. From many sources, Dr. Carroll says, I give but a few illustrations, and there are many, many more in church history and in U.S. history than what he has time and space to put in. Before the Massachusetts Bay Colony is 20 years old, with the Congregational as a state church, they passed laws against the Baptists and others. The following is a sample of the laws. Quote, it is ordered and agreed that if any person or persons within this jurisdiction shall either openly condemn or oppose the baptizing of infants, or go about secretly to seduce others from the approbation or use thereof, or shall purposely depart the congregation at the ministration of the ordinance, after due time and means of conviction, every such person or persons shall be sentenced to banishment. Unquote. This law was enacted especially against the Baptist. By the authorities of this colony, Roger Williams and others were banished. Banishment in America in those days was something desperately serious. It meant to go and live among the Indians. In this case, Williams was received kindly and for a while lived among the Indians, and in after days proved a great blessing to the colony which banished him. He saved the colony from destruction by this same tribe of Indians, by his earnest entreaties on their behalf. In this way, he returned good for evil. Roger Williams later, together with others, some of whom, at least, had also been banished from that and other of the colonies, among whom was John Clarke, a Baptist preacher, decided to organize a colony of their own. As yet, they had no legal authority from England to do such a thing, but they thought this step wiser under existing conditions than to attempt to live in existing colonies with the awful religious restrictions then placed upon them. So, finding a small section of land as yet unclaimed by any existing colony, they proceeded to establish themselves on that section of land now known as Rhode Island. That was in the year of 1638, 10 years later than the Massachusetts Bay Colony. But it was about 25 years later, in 1663, before they were able to secure a legal charter. In the year 1651, Roger Williams and John Clarke were sent by the colony to England to secure, if possible, legal permission to establish their colony. When they reached England, Oliver Cromwell was in the charge of the government, but for some reason he failed to grant their request. Roger Williams returned home to America. John Clarke remained in England to continue to press his plea. Year after year went by. Clarke continued to remain. Finally, Cromwell lost his position, and Charles II sat upon the throne of England. While Charles is regarded in history as the bitterest of persecutors of Christians, he finally, in 1663, granted that charter. And I would say that was probably God's hand in doing that. So Clarke, after 12 long years of waiting, returned home with that charter. So in 1663, the Rhode Island colony became a real legal institution, and the Baptists could write their own constitution. And here's where it gets interesting. That constitution was written. It attracted the attention of the whole wide world, because in that Constitution was the world's first declaration of religious liberty. The battle for absolute religious liberty, even in America alone, is a great history within itself. And in this series, we're just barely skimming across the tops, if you will. For a long time, the Baptists seem to have fought that battle entirely alone. But they did not fight it for themselves alone, but for all peoples of every religious faith. Rhode Island, the first Baptist colony, established by a small group of Baptists after 12 years of earnest pleading for permission, was the first spot on earth where religious liberty was made the law of the land. The settlement was made in 1638. The colony legally established in 1663. In this colony, 2 Baptist churches were organized even prior to the legal establishment of the colony. As to the exact date of the organization of at least one of these 2 churches, even the Baptists, according to history, are at disagreement. All seem to agree as to the date of the organization of the one in Providence by Roger Williams in 1639. As to the date of the one organized in Newport by John Clarke, all the later testimony seems to give the date at 1638, 1 year before Roger Williams. All the earlier seems to give it later, some years later. The one organized by Roger Williams at Providence seemed to have lived but a few months. The other by John Clarke at Newport is still living, at least in the 1930s when Dr. Carroll was presenting these. He says, my own opinion of the organization of the Newport Church, based on all available data, is that 1638 is the correct date. So we could determine that the first scriptural Baptist church established in America was the one that was started with John Clarke and those folks in Newport, Rhode Island. Some history will say that Roger Williams was the first, but I have my doubts as to whether Roger Williams established a scriptural church or not. There are some questions about Roger Williams, but you know how modern secularists are. They'll take the prominent one, Roger Williams, and that's what they've run with. And so it's not as well known that actually it was John Clarke and those who were with him that really established the First Baptist Church in America, not Roger Williams. Back to Dr. Carroll, he says, personally, I am sure this date is correct. As to the persecutions in some of the American colonies, we will give a few samples. It's recorded that on one occasion, one of John Clarke's members was sick. The family lived just across the Massachusetts Bay colony line and was just inside that colony. John Clarke himself and a visiting preacher by the name of Crandall and a layman by the name of Obediah Holmes, all three went to visit that sick family. While they were holding some kind of prayer service with that sick family, some officer or officers of the colony came upon them and arrested them and later carried them before the court for trial. It is also stated that in order to get a more definite charge against them, they were carried into a religious meeting of their church, Congregationalists, with their hands being tied, so the record states. The charge against them was for not taking off their hats in the religious service. They were all tried and convicted. Governor Endicott was present. Remember that fellow? In a rage, he said to Clarke, while the trial was going on, "You have denied infants baptism." This was not the charge against him. "You deserve death. I will not have such trash brought into my jurisdiction." Did I tell you where he stood? The penalty for all was a fine or be well whipped. Crandall's fine, a visitor, was £5, equal to about $25, at least in Dr. Carroll's day. Clarke's fine, the pastor, was £20, to about $100. Holmes' fine, the records say that he had been a Congregationalist and had joined the Baptist. So his fine was £30, or $150. You think they were trying to get back at him? Clarke's and Crandall's fines were paid by friends. Holmes refused to have his fine paid, saying he had done no wrong, so was well whipped. The record states that he was stripped to the waist and then whipped with some kind of special whip until the blood ran down his body and then his legs until his shoes overflowed. The record goes on to state that his body was so badly gashed and cut that for 2 weeks he could not lie down so his body could touch the bed. His sleeping had to be done on his hands or elbows and knees. Of this whipping and others connected with it, I read all records, even Holmes' statement, Dr. Carroll says. A thing could hardly have been more brutal, and here in America. Painter, another man, refused to have his child baptized and gave as his opinion, quote, that infant baptism was an anti-Christian ordinance, unquote. For these offenses, he was tied up and whipped. Governor Winthrop tells us that Painter was whipped, quote, for reproaching the Lord's ordinance, unquote. In the colony where Presbyterianism was the established religion, dissenters, Baptists and others, seemed to fare no better than in the Massachusetts Bay Colony where Congregationalism was the established religion. In this colony was a settlement of Baptists. In the whole settlement were only 5 other families. The Baptists recognized the laws they were under and were, according to the records, obedient to them. This incident occurred. It was decided by authorities of the colony to build a Presbyterian meeting house in that Baptist settlement. The only way to do it seemed by taxation. The Baptists recognized the authority of the Presbyterians to level this new and extra tax, but they made this plea against the tax at this time, quote, "We have just started our settlement. Our little cabins have just been built, and little gardens and patches have just been opened. Our fields are not cleared. We have been taxed to the limit to build a fort for protection against the Indians. We cannot possibly pay another tax now." Now you notice they did not refuse to pay it. They just asked for a delay in paying it. That's the only substance to their plea. The tax was levied. It could not possibly be paid at that time. An auction was called. Sales were made. Their cabins and gardens and patches and even their graveyards were sold, but not their unopened fields. Property valued at £363 and 5 shillings was sold for £35 and 10 shillings. And I bet you they didn't get a bit of the money. Some of it, at least, was said to have been bought by the preacher who was to preach there. The settlement was said to have been left ruined. A large book could be filled with oppressive laws. Terrifically burdensome acts of taxation, hard dealing of many sorts, directed mainly against the Baptist. But these lectures cannot enter into these details. In the southern colonies, throughout the Carolinas and especially Virginia, where the Church of England held sway, persecution of Baptists was serious and continuous. Many times their preachers were fined and imprisoned. From the beginning of the colonial period to the opening of the Revolutionary War, more than 100 these persecutions of Baptists were persisted in. We give some examples of the hardships of Baptists in Virginia, and yet strange as it may now seem, Virginia was the next place on earth after Rhode Island to adopt religious liberty. But that was more than a century away. But the hardships, as many as 30 preachers at different times, were put in jail with the only charge against them, quote, for preaching the gospel of the Son of God, unquote. James Ireland is a case in point. He was imprisoned. After imprisonment, his enemies tried to blow him up with gunpowder. That having failed, they next tried to smother him to death by burning sulfur under his windows at the jail. Failing also in this, they tried to arrange with a doctor to poison him. All this failed. He continued to preach to his people from the windows. A wall was then built around his jail so people could not see in nor he see out. But even that difficulty was overcome. The people gathered, a handkerchief was tied to a long stick, and that stuck up above the wall so Ireland could see when they were ready. The preaching continued. 3 Baptist preachers, Lewis and Joseph Craig and Aaron Bledsoe, were later arrested on the same charge. One of them, at least, was a blood relative of R.E.B. Baylor, and possibly of one or more other Texas Baptist preachers. Baylor was the one that founded the Baylor University. These preachers were arraigned for trial. Patrick Henry, hearing of it, though living many miles away, and though a Church of England man himself, rode those miles horseback to the trial and volunteered his services in their defense. Great was his defense. Dr. Carroll says, I cannot enter into a description of it here. It swept the court. The preachers were freed. Because of the length of this particular lecture by Dr. Carroll, I'm going to conclude it in the next presentation, as I mentioned at the beginning. The persecution did not start for the Baptists even when they entered the land of freedom. I don't know about you, but I'm thankful that all these Baptists remained faithful to the Lord and His teachings, aren't you?